introduce our artist today. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate. And some, housekeeping. My chair is really squeaky, so you might hear that. And my cat is playing ping pong ball, so you can probably hear that. So, Romi, thank you so much for being here. And Sharita also, thank you so much for being here. So, Roshni asked me to give a little background about spatial realities. So, I have been thinking a lot about two authors, which is Sharita Devi. She was born in 1926, and she wrote a lot about this book called Imaginary Maps. And they talk a lot about like how globalization is not only coming from America and the first world, but my own country has always robbed me, has always wanted to rob the people. And then in coordination with that, I've been thinking about Catherine McKittrick, who Sharita Towne introduced me to, who was born in 1970. So when you minus 1970 to 26, it's 44 years plus 8. So I just wanted to put that in place. The quote that I refer back to from Catherine McKittrick is, "It is the margin that is a descriptor for women's politics that simultaneously marks place and takes place." So thinking a lot about how the roots of intersectionality is a spatial concept, and personally for me, how Black feminist praxis sort of breaks open, or I hope, breaks open some third world feminism. So thinking about a lot of those ideas. So Spatial Realities is a 3-part lunchtime series rooted in understanding realities of queer spatiality, public, physical, digital, and personal. So I was thinking about mainly 3 artists, who's Romi, who works with themes of spatiality, Ariella Tai, and then before Romi was Meenakshi Thirukod, and they all respond and engage in following questions in an open format. Is it possible to imagine a space that values love, and what does that even feel like? What does geography, urban landscape, cultural landscape looks like when heteronormative limitations don't counter the world we live in? What does it mean to even be in space, digital, physical, public, and social, as who we are? How, through various interventions, do we make space available for us? What does it require from us? How does race and space, physical, digital, spatial, and metaphysical, inform each other? And how can we still dream of togetherness? I understand these are like really large stroke abstract questions. So I really appreciate all of you bringing specificity to it and thinking through a lot of things that we all grapple with. So I'll just introduce Romi and Sharita and just leave the program to them. They have been coordinating together, and I'm super excited to hear what they've been doing. Romi Morrison is an interdisciplinary artist, researcher, and educator. Their work investigates the personal, political, ideological, and spatial boundaries of race, ethics, and social infrastructure within digital technologies. Using maps, data, sound, performance, and video, their installations center Black feminist technologies that challenges the demand of an increasingly quantified world, reducing land into property, people into digits, and knowledge into data. Romi has exhibited work and given talks at numerous exhibition, conferences, and workshops around the world, including Transmedial in Berlin, Alt CPH, Biennial in Copenhagen, the American Institutes of Architects in New York, Tribeca Film, Festival Museum of Contemporary Art, and I can keep going, so I'll just stop there for a second. And then Sharita Towne is a multidisciplinary artist, educator, and a friend based in Portland, born and raised on the west coast of the US alongside Interstate 5 from Salem, Oregon to Tacoma, Washington, and down to Sacramento, California. She is most interested in engaging local and global Black geographies, histories, and possibilities. In her work, a shared arc penetrates and binds people, artists, audience, organizers, civic structures, sisters, cousins, and landscape in collective catharsis, grief, and joy. Towne holds a BA from UC Berkeley and an MFA from Portland State University. Her work has received support from organizations including Creative Capital, Fulbright Association, Art Matters, the Ford Family Foundation, Oregon Community Foundation, Oregon Humanities, Oregon Arts Commission, the Miller Foundation, the Regional Arts and Cultural Council, an MRG Leela Jewell Award, and the Andy Warhol Foundation of Visual Arts. I can also keep going in her accolades. So I'll stop there and I will give it to Ron and Sharita. Thank you.
Hi, all. So thank you for that introduction. I'm just going to set up my screen share really quickly and we can get started. Okay, can you all see and hear me now? Perfect.
Yes.
So thank you, Garima, for that introduction. And I'd also just really like to thank Arshani and Misha for their support in organizing this event, as well as Sharita Towne for being in conversation today. The talk that I prepared for today is called Uncertain Threads, Black Quilt Making and Shared Risk Taking. And so today I want to talk to you about quilt patterns, about fugitivity, data, and space. But really, I'd like you to sit with a question of risk. And so I want to ask, in the face of uncertainty, how do you respond to risk? What are the things often forgotten that we need to carry with us? And what can we now allow to fray and break and be okay with the brokenness? And so I'd like to invite you to allow those words to wash over you, to release the pressure to capture them, and instead to allow yourself to be a sieve, to pay attention to those errant turbidities that collect in patches, because these are the beginnings for new ground, and moving takes practice. And so we begin with a question: what if we cared for each other with an ease that holds shared risk? And in order to get there, I want to open with the closing lines of one of my favorite poems. So this is a poem called From Sea to Shining Sea by June Jordan. Sucked by the tongue and the lips, while the teeth release the succulence of all voluptuous disintegration, I am turning under the trees. I am trailing blood into the rivers. I am walking loud along the streets. I am digging my nails and my heels into the land. I am opening my mouth. I am just about to touch the pomegranates piled up precarious. This is a good time. This is the best time. This is the only time to come together. Fractious, kicking, spilling, burly, whirling, raucous, messy, free, exploding like the seeds of a natural disorder. These are the words that close June Jordan's poignant poem From Sea to Shining Sea. Following the rise of Ronald Reagan and his ascendance to the presidency in 1980, this poem is one of escape, incommensurability, and refusal in the face of an authoritarian shift, reductive politics, and the normalization of precarity. In short, this is a poem that is about survival that stretches beyond the regulating edges of possibility. The poem opens with a scene of valuation and the regulation of everyday life. Jordan writes that natural order is being restored. Natural order means you take a pomegranate, that encapsulated plastic-looking orb, complete with its little top, a childproof cap that you can neither twist nor turn, and you keep the pomegranate stacked inside a wobbly pyramid composed of 103 additional pomegranates, next to a sign saying 89 cents each. Natural order is being restored. Natural order does not mean a pomegranate split open to the seeds, sucked by the tongue and lips, while teeth release the succulent sounds of its voluptuous disintegration. The natural order is not about a good time. This is not a good time to be against the natural order, end quote. In this scene, Jordan describes the everyday spread of economic dispossession through newly liberated financial markets that marked the Reagan administration and a stark shift towards neoliberal economic policy in the US. This attention to the exact number of pomegranates piled into a wobbly pyramid, the labeling of the price, the line break before each, are intentional moves that draw our attention to what Michelle Murphy would call the economization of life. By this, she means, quote, the practices that differentially value and govern life in terms of their ability to foster the macroeconomy of the nation state, such as life's ability to contribute to the gross domestic product of the nation, end quote. Jordan continues, this was not a good time to be found with a gun. This was not a good time to be found without one. This was not a good time to be gay. This was not a good time to be Black. This was not a good time to be a pomegranate or an orange. This was not a good time to be against the natural order. She uses the line, this was not a good time to be a, each time inserting a different subject position, as a device to show both the pervasiveness of who was affected, as well as the sectarian divisions that rose in response. Jordan speaks to this tension in a 1981 interview with Adrienne Livingston.
Americans now are just really just sort of like overwhelmed, like what is happening, what can we do, and you know, and everybody's tendency, understandably, is to try and take care of yourself, you know, cover your back, make sure you have a house, you know, a door for the key. And I say that as understandable as that is, it seems to me we cannot afford to divorce ourselves from what is happening in South Africa, for example, or for that matter, what is happening in West Germany or Poland, any more than the Reagan administration divides these issues. I think that the Reagan administration, the people in that, they see everything in global terms, you know. From Brooklyn to Angola is not a big jump for them at all. And I say that I think that unless we, the people, are begin to be able rapidly to think in the same way, to make these connections really on a visceral level. I fear for the survival of us as a
And so her
species.
words resound today as an echo. We are currently entangled in cascading scenes of stark economic inequality, increasing climate crisis, mass global displacement, a rapidly growing global pandemic, and intensified state-sanctioned and extralegal racial violence centered in xenophobia, anti-Blackness, and cis-heteropatriarchy. While the edges of this violence continue to expand, encircling those previously thought safe, hunkered behind thin walls of whiteness, denial, or entitlement, the scale of this precarity seems to be matched only by the consolidation of land, computing power, and space. Such hubristic endeavors are built upon massive computational infrastructures. Referring to this dramatic enclosure of vital aspects of our lives as the Screen New Deal, Naomi Klein describes the looming potential future as, quote, this is a future in which for the privileged, almost everything is home delivered, either virtually via streaming and cloud technology, or physically via driverless cars or drone, then screen shared on a mediated platform. It's a future that employs far fewer teachers, doctors, and drivers. It accepts no cash or credit cards and has skeletal mass transit and far less live art. It's a future that claims to be run on artificial intelligence, but is actually held together by tens of millions of anonymous workers, tucked away in warehouses, data centers, content moderation mills, electronic sweatshops, lithium mines, industrial farms, meat processing plants, and prisons, where they are left unprotected from disease and hyperexploitation. It's a future in which our every move, our every word, our every relationship is trackable, traceable, and data mineable by unprecedented collaborations between governments and tech giants. Yet today, as was the case in 1980, is not a time of futility, but of radical reimagining and visceral reconnection. In the closing of this poem, Jordan returns to the pomegranate, finally succumbed to desire, voluptuously disintegrating. In the final line, she writes that this is the only time to come together, fractious, kicking, spilling, burly, whirling, rockies, messy, free, exploding like the seeds of a natural disorder. Embedded in this call is a politics of refusal, to refuse the grammar of the present order, to come together in all the ways that are sought to be exercised, messy, spilling, and raucous. It is a call to entanglement, to fugitivity, and to emancipation in the fullest sense of the word that is endlessly committed to life. I want to take up this call to wrestle with our present moment. This talk takes seriously the call that June Jordan makes and the emergence of a fugitive politics of refusal, so that a new world can be born. It takes aim at these competing worlds, one that responds to risk by writing the complexity of life as calculable units, rendered as GDP, as productivity and debt. The other world begins with the refusal of the present order of things. It embarks upon various inventions of flight, giving flesh, to quote, the beauty of Black ordinary, the beauty that resides in and animates the determination to live free, the beauty that propels the experiments in living otherwise, end quote. And so it becomes time to ask, if the current world responds to risk through predictive control, what does it look like to endure a proximity to uncertainty? Stay close to the trouble of uncertainty, to break the current moment so that queer and Black forms of meeting risk together can enter onto the scene. And how might such a proximity allow for the messy work of sharing risk together instead of the violent clarity of prediction? And so in the face of a lot of these immense questions and immense precarity, I'm really trying to learn to listen to everyday spaces and practices that escape the capture of quantification and prediction, the overlooked, the forgotten, the ritualistic, and the small. And so I'm listening to quilts. I'm listening to Black forms of pattern making that make symmetry from contrast, that buck uniformity, and that can only be made through ensemble. Tina Campt refers to this mode of listening as infrasonic, writing, quote, those ultra-low frequencies emitted by or audible only to certain animals, such as elephants, rhinoceroses, and whales. While the ear is the primary organ for perceiving sound, at lower frequencies, infrasound is only felt in the form of vibrations through contact with parts of the body, end quote. Listening in this mode is not heard, but it's felt. It is this feeling that allows Campt to find fugitive practices in the quiet and the quotidian. Campt describes the quotidian as a practice that is, quote, honed by the dispossessed in the struggle to create possibility within the constraints of everyday life. For Blacks in diaspora, both quiet and the quotidian are mobilized as everyday practices of refusal, end quote. Campt offers us a renewed vision of refusal and fugitive practices. I find this vision to be humbling and careful in its handling. It's not spectacular or romantic. It's not a criminal on the run or a thief pilfering university coffers. It's not an individual at all, but a practice as incredible as the everyday endurance of Black life to create possibility from constraint. This in part returns fugitivity to the body without entombing it. It is where flight meets the ground without landing. It is in the sweat that permeates pores, the exhaustion as breath leaves the lungs, the smell of fresh soil during midnight mirage. It is a fugitivity that is situated rather than flattened. Bill Arnett, in his text, Souls Grown Deep, writes that, quote, quilts represent one of the most highly evolved systems of writing in the New World. Every combination of colors, every juxtaposition or intersection of line and form, every pattern, traditional or idiosyncratic, contain data that can be imparted in some form or another to anyone. All across Africa, geometric designs, the syntax of quilt tops have been used to encode symbolic or secret knowledge. Listening to quilts means to feel the craft of their construction, the collecting of colors, patterns, and thread. Quilting bees held under dim light, secrets told in hushed voices. It is to feel the stories and wisdom they contain. Their data is not available for the taking. It requires something of you. It is encrypted through culture. Diana Taylor would call this a repertoire. Rather than the data used for predictive ends, the repertoire, quote, enacts embodied memory, performances, gestures, orality, movement, dance, singing. In short, all of those acts usually thought of as ephemeral and non-reproducible knowledge, end quote. She goes on to state that, quote, the repertoire requires presence. People participate in the production and reproduction of knowledge by being there, being a part of the transmission. As opposed to the supposedly stable objects in the archive, the actions that are the repertoire do not remain the same. The repertoire both keeps and transforms choreographies of meaning. And so Black quilt making practices in particular work as repertoires for culturally encoding and sharing information across continents and generations. The repertoire requires presence as its mode of transmission. Through the presence of participants coming together again and again, knowledge is produced and reproduced. It is stitched into fabric and held in the fleshy extensions of those that share space on unruly grounds. In this context, the transmission of information is not separate from the material embodiment of those involved. In fact, it is dependent on material bodies in relation. The data is not encoded and transmitted. The data is encoded and transmitted through acts taken together. It remains local. As a mode of information sharing and knowledge production, the fugitive repertoire is encased in shared cultural practices made available through the intimacy of coming together. It is not interoperable or modular. Instead, it requires something of you. To partake in the knowledge, you must learn the stitch, read the pattern, and sit at the quilting bee. The repertoire makes explicit, endured agreements of trust, building practices of interdependence in order to share risk together. Elsa Barkley Brown speaks really brilliantly about the ways that material cultures often carry alternate ways for socially, economically, and politically ordering the world. Speaking specifically about Black women's quilting practices, she writes, quote, African-American quilters prefer the sporadic use of the same material in several squares when this material could have been used uniformly because they prefer variation to regularity. In other words, the symmetry in African-American quilts does not come from uniformity as it does in Euro-American quilts. Rather, the symmetry comes through the diversity, end quote. Brown connects these errant practices of quilting to other Black cultural forms such as jazz improvisation and polyrhythmic drumming. Both are united through a considered practice of making structure through contrast and difference. Brown articulates these forms as expressions of true democracy. As she writes, quote, for each person is allowed, in fact required, to be an individual, to go his or her own way, and yet to do so in concert with the group, to be an individual in the context of the community, end quote. And so I'm looking for rituals of protection in the histories of Black quilting practices as a form to consider how those before us encoded and shared information to navigate risk and move across space. In particular, I've been researching the contested patterns used to create the Freedom Quilts. The Freedom Quilts were a series of quilts rumored to have been used as a clandestine system for mapping escape routes for enslaved Black people to flee themselves from the plantation. Quilts were constructed according to a technical protocol of sewn symbols, stitching patterns, and tied knots. This quilt code includes 10 primary patterns and a number of secondary patterns. Each pattern had two meanings, both signaling when to prepare to escape and giving clues to indicate safe routes of passage. After leaving the plantation, enslaved people would encounter quilts bearing single patterns left in public to air. Following these codes, they would know when to gather the tools they needed for the coming journey the time to escape from the plantation, ways to navigate hundreds of miles to destinations in the north, how to calculate mileage between safe houses, the local topography, places to find fresh clothes and shelter, and practices for recognizing other confidants. The patterns themselves changed often to insulate from outside parties learning and understanding the quilt code. For such a complex system to work, it required a tremendous amount of labor and shared risk. And so it's this engagement with the Freedom Quilts that inspired my own installation, Rituals for Black Fugitivity. In this piece, I asked people to carve out the time and space, and in doing so, to pay homage to an aspect of life, which is to engage in ritual. Rituals of Black Fugitivity is a mixed media sound installation that includes a large interactive quilt made of repurposed newspaper, woven textiles, conductive thread, and a single board microcontroller. The quilt is stitched from numerous rectangular strips of overlapping and fragmented newsprint and the symbol of the log cabin. Within the fugitive practices of the Freedom Quilts, the log cabin was a code used to signify a space of sanctuary or rest within the violent landscape of plantation capitalism. Here, the digital is returned to the digit, to the hand, to haptics, textures, and textiles, to the process of making through material. Ritual stages a scene of stolen time by which Black people carve impossible moments for freedom through ritual practice. The scene falls out of linear time, and instead it compresses space-time, folding the past into the future, where ritual meets technology and thread meets circuit. At the center of the quilt are 3 folded paper fans triggered by touch that play a series of sound compositions detailing my own rituals for daily protection. The sound compositions are site-specific and sourced from field recordings of daily walks taken in New Orleans, where this piece was first made and exhibited. Sound works as an invitation, and voice finds dialogue within the interface of the quilt. By listening to my rituals for protection, it asks you to consider your own. I think of this installation as a database that requires us to step into it. It is not important if our experiences are commensurable or equivalent. They need not be measured. What is important is that we are engaged in a relation. The data is not separate from my body or the accrued practices of imagination and rebellion that my ancestors continue to carry. This relation is one that we contend with through maintaining an endured proximity outside of measure. This means that as we collect data about the external world, we cannot continue to think of ourselves as transparent or inconsequential in our relationship to what is being indexed. Instead, we must contend with our relationship to the index, to see ourselves in the Black spaces of its stolen time and in relation to fugitive knowledge. It suspends the question of technology from being answered and leaves open room for ritual techne to wander. And so what I'm currently working on right now is a deeper exploration from this project, still thinking about interactive textiles, sound, information sharing, and cultural data practices through a piece that I've been calling the Future Conditional. And the Future Conditional is a series of networked sound installations similar to what you just saw, but rather than standalone pieces, they're networked together so that they share information back and forth. And I'm still very much invested in interactive textiles and Black diasporic pattern making. And so this project takes its name from Tina Camp's evocation of Black feminist futurity as a conditional practice, as, quote, a performance of a future that hasn't happened yet, but must. And so what you'll see right here is a short video of me starting to prototype some of the speakers that will eventually be embedded into the quilt. So trying to make speakers and mix, again, these kind of digital technologies with physical materials so that when you're listening to the quilts, you're actually listening through the materiality of the fabric versus something kind of artificially implanted on top of it. And so this work stays with the tension of the archive and the database as both evidence of past violence, as well as their impossibility to express what lives beyond numbers and material records. And I engage this work as a series of conversations about Black feminist futures, asking, again, what are the things often forgotten that we need to carry with us? And what can we now allow to fray and break and be okay with the brokenness? And I've been asking this question to numerous different people and having them send in short audio responses, of which I'm compiling a larger sound composition that will be embedded into the quilts, so that as you're interacting with the quilts, you can listen to how people have responded to these questions, as well as starting to prototype a way that you can actually speak into the quilts and have your voice included in this ongoing sound composition. And so what I'd like to close with is just listening to a rough draft of the sound composition that I've been working on, featuring contributions from Catherine McKittrick, who Garima kind of introduced at the beginning of this talk and event for today, as well as the poet Alexis Pauline Gumbs and my mom.
The history of Black people in America
I'll need
begins
something
with
short.
generation to generation.
June Jordan and
One.
love.
What to take with us. Don't forget the sweet, the small, the honey-soaked, the extra. Don't forget the part of you that makes your own mouth water.
Jordan's poem Love is about ecology.
And cherish the water itself, the water within you moving out, the water without you becoming you
He
anyway.
escaped from the slave life of the shadow.
Keep any methods you have developed for tuning in to the older
From the
yes,
bottom of the pool
to the long
to the
before,
stars.
to the love
So much of
underneath.
mainstream white America doesn't get it.
And under your tongue, remember, you hold the prayer, and you can say it now.
My father talked a lot of things last,
Two,
but no one discussed feelings or
what
aspirations.
to let go.
The love is particular and chronic.
Your gut knows
Shirley told us
what
she loved
you
us
want to
for his
release.
children.
It was made for releasing. Ask it to aggregate what you don't need.
Experiencing all of that together.
Mine says, I no longer need that talent for convincing,
I'll need something.
nor do I need the parable of proof,
Sometimes I felt alone.
nor do I want the grid I made of other people's wrongness, all my own.
This is what forever feels like, because this is moving
The question,
through this iterative abandonment, this lesson.
where do you feel it?
We are taught to hate things that make us special. Sometimes we direct the hate at ourselves.
Maybe this too is what possibility
We need to
feels
talk
like.
about the issues that affect we have to first love ourselves in order to love and respect
Thank you.
others.
Romi, thank you. I know that we're supposed to end at 1, but I just want to give you both time. So if it extends, that's fine, but I just want you both to have the time that you need to talk. So if you
Yeah,
can be here.
okay. Well, I don't know about the other people that were here, but your girl has been crying. It's like, it's so many things. It's so many things. Thank you. It's so good to cry a little bit today. I think I'm gonna just kind of read through some of my notes and questions, and in the same way that we were kind of all asked to kind of be a sieve in the beginning. I want us to kind of be a sieve for some of my thinking and questions in response to this. And then maybe we'll kind of zoom out and then zoom back into one or two. But first, I want to just acknowledge that, you know, in seeing this work and having questions about it, there's a certain amount that I want to remain to be kind of discreet and coded and unspoken. And the difference of something that might be over the phone or in a letter or something that I'd ask 5 years from now because it stuck with me versus something kind of within the 12-ish minutes that we have in the hour that we've allotted. So it's different. It's interesting. It's kind of I feel a comforting discomfort about what I can ask or should ask or may not ask. And then also I'll say, having read the texts that accompany this work, I'm also thinking about how so many of my questions have already been answered and then some. You know, like I don't know that the kind of phrasing "you thought this through" applies, because I think it's more than that. It's more like the thinking has done its work on you, and as such, like, you've done the work that is then required when thinking does its work on you. And it's so I don't know, it's humbling in a way to kind of get to be alongside in this way with that work being done. And I think it is work that's collective. And I think that that's what citation does in this work so much, is it kind of literally like ebbs and flows, or it creates this textile pattern that extends beyond kind of like the space and time of this conversation and back into June Jordan, everything. So thank you for bringing the past and present and future all into one in this work. Some of my questions with the quilts, in the "You Can't Count Your Way Out of This" text you wrote, you mentioned that the quilting bees as this collective work, as this social space. And so I was curious what kind of way you thought or felt, or your process felt collective as you culled things for your quilts. You know, who or what were you, did you find yourself in conversation or working with? And so my first question was around culling, like what made you cull newspaper, but also what are some of the ways that you culled material, and when did you find yourself culling it? What times of day, what kinds of ideas or feelings or intentions did you find yourself infusing into the materials in the act of quilting? And then the second piece, well, the other piece embedded in there around audio and audio quilting, you know, there's a moment with in one of the first piece of Octavia Butler, you know, "God is change and I hear this water," and all of those pieces, like the collaging and quilting that's happening in sound. And there's a way that not only just like the actual source material of capturing sound on a walk or something, you know, from citation, but like there's a culling of like dips and bends in the tones and cadence. Like some sounds are clear and tinny, and then some are more muffled. And when I listen to it, I find myself kind of like rising and laying as I do in the day, in my quotidian day. And so then I find myself, I was wondering about the same intentionality of when you find yourself kind of gathering and composing sound. Yeah, so I guess my question is around the culling and assemblage, the collectivity in it, and kind of individual moments that you find yourself working on it. What is that process, and what is the material relationships? Why newspaper? Thank you for sitting through that really question.
Yeah.
Okay, we did it.
No. There's a lot there to respond to. I'm thankful for this question. So, you know, obviously, like, culling it's a big part of the practice, like both the layering, like the partial use of newsprint, right? So they're like cut into strips, the assemblage, the collage, because I think that's what feels natural to me to make things. And often that's how I even know what I need to make at some point, is that I feel drawn to certain things. So like I think like maybe, I feel like I heard like an NPR story about that text, Hidden in Plain View, which is like the first kind of documentation of the Freedom Quilts that came out maybe 2000, 2001. It's a bit older now. And so that just kind of stuck out in my mind, and then would encounter other quilt artists. When I was living in New York at the time, a lot of people that are working with physical computing and trying to do interesting things with quilts as interfaces. And I got this residency to work in New Orleans through the Joan Mitchell Center. And while there, you know, I go for walks all the time to just kind of process and accumulate things. And going into that residency, I wasn't quite sure what I was going to work on. I had a sense that I wanted to do something in relation to quilts and the Freedom Quilts, but it hadn't taken any kind of form yet. And so going on walks, I would record things. And then because I had this studio space, I would open it up for people to just kind of come through and hang out and spend time in. So there's a lot of both like actual people that I'm just like in conversation with a lot, kind of talking through what I'm thinking. There's a lot of just like stowing away like interesting articles, clippings, like audio stories for later, but all around these shared themes of what it means to navigate space, to like confront risk and move across space, and to do that in a way that doesn't have the assurances or maybe doesn't want to adhere to a political affinity around border as a way to like protect yourself when thinking about space. So if you are wanting to be on the move, or if like a fugitive practice or that kind of politics of refusal resonates with you, then it becomes a real question of, well, how do you maintain yourself and each other when you are on the move? And so I think because those are like longstanding questions that then, you know, kind of filters what gets collected and culled. And so coming back to your question about like the materiality in particular, because I was in New Orleans, I was researching different practices of protection. And that's really where that first piece was built from. So both the Freedom Quilt is a reference, the log cabin is a specific symbol within the Freedom Quilts. The reason that it's cut into strips is because it's emulating the strip quilt. So there's a quilt theorist named Maud Southwell who writes a lot about the translation of different African cosmologies, African textile practices that are then translated through the diaspora into Black quilt making practices in the South. And the strip quilt is like a primary form of doing that. So I like it because it's also partial, right? It doesn't give you full access to a complete image. It is literally an assemblage in of itself. Also, it dates back to different practices of like Yoruba and West African traditions where, because the written word was held to be sacred, you would take a piece of writing, cut it into strips, and as a way to ward off like bad spirits, you would line the inside of your home with that kind of scrambled written text, because even spirits would have to acknowledge the sacredness of the word and try to decode it before they could enter your home. So that's why the newsprint, why it's kind of cut into strips. And then there's also a translation of that into various New Orleanian practices where people would insulate the inside of their homes with newsprint. So it's this constant kind of mapping, remapping, and translation that happens through diasporic work all around these questions of protection and space and how to protect your space within diaspora and within movement. So I wanted to kind of like try to exemplify some of those legacies and kind of like the accumulation of them within the quilts themselves. And then thinking about like the sound. So the audio that I played for you was made after that first quilt was created. There's a separate sound composition that goes with the quilt that I showed for today, but I wanted to show something new, so I showed something new. And I would say that I've been thinking a lot more about the sound than the first iteration. And a lot of the reference, or like the conceptual reference, comes from this, what am I blanking on her name? Louisa Teich's book, Jambalaya, which I recommended to you, I think yesterday when you're on the phone, Sharita. And in it, she's talking about this practice called Gumbo Yaya, which is so Louisa Teich is like a womanist spiritualist practitioner, scholar who had been based in New Orleans for a long time, is from New Orleans, and writes about coming home to visit her family in New Orleans, and Gumbo Yaya is a particular way of sharing stories. And so when she comes to kind of like, you know, inform her family about what's been going on with her life, when she comes home for a visit, everyone speaks at the same time in the circle. And so as everyone's speaking at the same time, people are also at the same time kind of editing their story live, depending on who's in the circle at the time, to show the relationship between them, who's in the circle, and the story. So the story shifts based on who's present, and it's this kind of live editing and telling simultaneously. So it sounds maybe cacophonous, but if you're accustomed to hearing in that way, then it's actually a practice of like relating each other through the stories that are being told. And so that's a lot of the conceptual reference for the audio piece that I shared, where it sounds like voices are kind of swelling and then kind of ebbing, because I wanted to give this sense of what it would be like to, you know, kind of train yourself to be in that relation of telling and listening in response to these quilts and in response to these accumulated stories that are kind of stitched into them.
My last question is a very frayed one, so we're gonna accept it.
Good.
So, you know, when I was reading the things, I'm looking at the things, I kind of like sighed aloud, and I almost said, but then I like stopped myself in the M. I was like, I almost said like, this is masterful. And I went, and my mouth just kind of froze because I got so grossed out. And then I realized I was thinking about I have it, I don't want to mess up the name here. This 2017 piece of Black Poetics Against Mastery by Don Lundy Martin. And there's a part in it, like there's some parallels between how they're talking about kind of a refusal of this term mastery and this kind of very predetermined pathway, because we like there's kind of it's the in-between spaces that gather between knowing, that's what's interesting, and where creative, you know, a certain kind of creativity lies that feels generative and important. And so I was curious to just kind of hear more about kind of the fray and the break, and what are kind of the frays and breaks that are alive for you today, and in this project that is kind of in process right now. What are some of the yeah
That's a great question. I want to just like think about it for a second. Yeah, I think there are a few things. I think one for me is definitely like this complicated relationship to isolation as maybe a form of protection. Is one that I feel often when I'm feeling like really spent, really overwhelmed, really like disheartened, which is how I've been feeling lately. Isolation is a thing that I've definitely learned to do over time as like a kind of form of protection, and the habit of self-isolating, even if I just start to feel, you know, the encroachment of like stress or duress. And so part of the fraying or breaking for me are around these kinds of like habits or like learned behaviors that, you know, were necessary, needed to serve a purpose, but really no longer do. So if I'm being really honest, like that's a lot of the fraying and breaking for me is around not just isolation, but these kind of similar, you know, learned kind of trauma responses that really impede, I think, what I really hope for through the ways that I'm kind of thinking through quilts, the assemblage of how they're made, which is really this kind of very textured woven sociality that's able to like hold and withstand tension or conflict, and still, you know, allows people to maintain a proximity together. So I think when I'm asking about fraying or breaking, for me personally, it's those kinds of behaviors around isolation or around like shutdown, not asking for help, all those types of things, like the asociality that we all kind of inherit, and that seems like almost rational at a time.
That's it for my questions. I have more. I'm going to turn it to Roshni to close and just say thank you to everybody that made it so that I got to do this. It's been really great. It's been really nice thing that just popped up. So thanks for having me, and thank you, Romi. And yeah, I'll turn it over to Roshni to close.
Roshni's having some tech issues, so I'm going to jump in to her place.
Yeah, or even Gutty, if you want to close too, anyone.
Candice, you can close. But I'm like teary, and I'm just going to sit here for a second.
None of us can close, like metaphorically. Open yourself to the day. Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Candice.
Yeah, I think I was accidentally muted just right for a second. But yeah, I also feel the same feeling. So it's going to be just as hard for me to come up with anyone else. But Roshni is
I'm
having
happy
some
to
tech
stay
issues.
here if people like have questions or want to talk more about anything that was shown today. I can't see anyone's faces that are in the room, but if any of the names on the screens are interested in just sticking around, I'm happy to talk more, do anything.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Romi and Sharita. Really just beautiful and thoughtful and resonant for me. And it sounds like a lot of other folks in the chat too. So much appreciation to you for being here today and being part of Queer Pulse this year. If folks want to hang out for a little bit, that's totally cool. I did want to just share a little bit of info on our next upcoming Queer Pulse event. Misha, I think there is a slide for this from what I understand. But if not, there's going to be another Spatial Realities talk coming up, as well as a presentation by our East Portland Art and Justice Lab artists in residence, as well as a storytelling event. So Misha just put some links in the chat. If any of those sound interesting to you, feel free to take a look. And we also have a marketplace going on with some featured artists sharing their work. So that's all we have for you today. Thanks so much for being here, everybody. And yeah, if you have questions, feel free to hang out. And if not, we will see you next time. Thanks all.
Thank you so much, Romi. Thank you so much, Rita. I know I asked you at the last minute, so I super appreciate. Does anybody have any questions for Romi or they want to talk about? Okay. Thank you so much. I really appreciated this.